Hello. So in this video I'm going to compare the performance of Power Auras Classic with Weak Auras. Now some people might not be aware that the Power Auras Classic add-on was more or less abandoned by its original authors. About a year ago they stopped working on Power Auras 4, and then Power Auras 5 never really came out. It didn't really work properly, and so they just kind of left it at that. We haven't really heard much from them since. A few people have taken it on themselves to kind of patch it up and make it keep working, to varying degrees of success. The one I'm going to be using for my comparison is this one here. It's on wowinterface.com. You can't install it via Curse client for whatever reason. They haven't put it up there. And I'm actually using the GitHub version from this link here. The reason is because when I was looking at the change logs, the GitHub version has a whole bunch of more entries in it. There's like fixed leaks, fix bugs, and all that sort of stuff. And the one on WoW Interface is just not quite as complete. So I wanted it to look as good as possible. And this version had more bug fixes. And during the testing, I didn't see an important difference in performance between the two. So I went with the more up-to-date one, even though it's a beta version. I've installed basically an empty copy of Warcraft. There's no tweaks or anything done. I've set the graphics to ultra, and I've turned off the game's music, and that's about it. I did install a couple of extra add-ons, though, in order to show you the CPU usage. So obviously I have Power Auras. I have Broker CPU, which is what's actually monitoring the CPU and memory usage. And then I have libqtip, add-on loader, and StatBlock Core, which is kind of showing that's all how this window is produced. And then I have just the release version of Weak Auras from Curse Client. Nothing special there. I think what I'm going to do is maybe reload the UI, and we'll just work our way through it. So to begin with, bring up Power Auras. You can see that there's no auras loaded anywhere. It's not like I'm hiding anything, so it's completely empty, fresh out of box. And the same is true of Weak Auras, nothing loaded or whatever. So I'm going to reload the UI, and that'll restart all our recording and memory logging stuff. Now in order to test this, I think what we should do is make a few auras. But before we do that, let's kind of get a short feeling for how these things work. Just out of the box, we see Weak Auras. Where is that? Down at the bottom here. It doesn't seem to be using very much CPU at all. It's kind of sitting idle at 0. It's using about 1 meg of RAM. Power Auras seems to be using a little bit, about 0.1%, and it's going all the time. So I'm not really sure what it's doing there, but it seems to be using CPU even when you're doing nothing. Memory use is fine, though. Realistically, if you have a modern gaming computer, the amount of RAM you're using for add-ons is almost completely irrelevant. The only time I would be concerned is if I saw an add-on that shouldn't be using a lot of memory that is. Things like combat logging options like Recount and SCADA, you expect those to use a lot of memory because they're recording all of your CPU, or all of your combat events. That doesn't necessarily translate into CPU usage. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But just because something uses memory isn't a good reason to dismiss it. If you want to see how it's going to impact your frame rates, you're going to be much better served by focusing on its CPU usage. Unfortunately, profiling out on CPU usage is actually CPU intensive. You can actually see there's a warning by Broker CPU saying, hey, you've turned on profiling. So you don't want to do it all the time. You just want to do it when you're noticing performance problems and you say, hey, I wonder if some add-on is causing me to stutter or have poor frame rates. You might come in here and just compare and see, oh, how much CPU is this using? How much is that using? Is one using a lot all the time? Is one like spiking up briefly during like periods of intense combat or something and then tapering off at other times? And see if you can find a correlation between its CPU usage and your frame rates deteriorating. There are cases where memory would matter, but I think for these kinds of add-ons, it is almost irrelevant. So I'm not going to worry too much about it unless I see one go up to like 100 meg of RAM. Then I would know something is wrong. So we've been letting these run for a little bit, and we see that Weak Auras still hasn't used any CPU time, really. Power Auras has used a little bit, but that's fine. Both of these have no auras set up, and that seems like a stupid way to compare them because no one installs these and then doesn't build anything. So what I'm going to do is just make a few add-ons as quickly as I can, and then we'll fire them up and test them. We'll try to make them very similar and see how the CPU usage is affected by both of them. So first what I'm going to do is something that just fires up when I have a buff. Let's say like Righteous Fury will do the job. So make a new aura, and I want that to be on the player. So I'm going to turn off some of these other options just so that it's not doing unnecessary checks to make it as kind of performant as possible. And I'll call this player, because that's me, and it's a buff called Righteous Fury. And I think that's good enough. The only other thing I want to do is maybe change the texture mode. So I'll set this to like add and drag this around a little bit. Sure, that's fine. And we'll come over to animation, and I'm going to turn off the end animation just to make it as simple as we can. But maybe I'll have a static one just going all the time. Something like, sure, spin anti-clockwise. That's pretty big, so maybe I'll just make it a little bit smaller, and I'll put it on the left side to compare it with weak auras. So just drag this to the left, push this up a little bit, and then we'll adjust the scale down somewhat. That's probably all right. Good enough. Does any of this matter? Not really. Okay, so now let's make the same aura with weak auras. So I'll bring up the weak auras config. And one thing we want to notice is that weak auras is structured a little different from power auras. When I bring up weak auras, we'll see an extra aura or an extra add-on loads up. That's the weak auras configuration options. Those have been separated from the weak auras display engine. So you can build a bunch of auras and then turn off the weak auras options, and they will never load for you. So they'll never use memory, they'll never use CPU. But when you bring them up, you can see they actually use quite a bit of memory, like 28 meg of RAM right now. And a fair bit of CPU. And that's just because this is a very complicated interface. It has lots of things going on, animations even on this little screen, lots going on there. So in order to make this really pretty, it's going to use up lots of memory and CPU. But notice how it's using lots of CPU now. We'll see that it goes away when we close this. So an icon actually isn't very fair. What we should use is texture. Pretty much everything that Power Auras makes would be the equivalent of a texture in Weak Auras. Weak Auras has some with more options and some with fewer, which might affect performance. So I'm going to try and keep it as similar as I can. I'm going to call this RF for Righteous Fury. I'm going to choose a different texture. And let's see, I'll set icons. And one of the differences here is that in Power Auras you can only really see one thing at a time. And you have to sort of use this scroller thing. That contributes to this being very nice and lightweight. Because this is a separate add-on that's detached from Weak Auras, the authors probably thought, well, because it's only going to be loaded when people are not doing anything, when frame rates don't really matter, we can afford to spend a bunch of extra memory and CPU to make this really easy to use and nice to browse. So there we go, I've chosen my aura. I'm going to set my blending type to glow, which is the equivalent of add. It's just named differently in Weak Auras. And I'm going to throw this up here so it's in basically the same position. Now I need a trigger. That's the buff named Righteous Fury. And I need to do some animation. So that's just going to be like a simple preset rotation. Rotate left, I guess, is the same. And that's a bit slow, so I'm actually going to switch that to custom. And I'm just going to turn on rotate, normal, through a full circle, and then I just come up here and I set how long it should take. So I'm going to say something like 1 second's probably pretty close to the other one. It looks about the same speed, so I'm going to be happy with that, and I'm going to close it. So I think what I'll do is reload the UI to give Power has used up almost a second of CPU not even doing anything. So I'm going to reload the UI just to make sure that they both have a nice clean start before we compare things, because it's not fair to compare the configuration windows, I don't think. Those don't really matter. Slash console, reload UI. So now they're both freshly loaded. And I'm going to class Righteous Fury. There we go, bring up the little configuration window here. And let's see. So we see Weak Auras is using about 0.2% CPU, and Power Auras is using around 0.3%, so a little bit more. Looking at the total used so far, we see Weak Auras is about 53 and Power Auras is about 100. So it seems like it's using about twice as much CPU to do basically the same aura. One difference is that, I don't know if it's going to come through on YouTube, but this one seems to be rotating a little more slowly, like the animation is less defined. On my screen anyway, it looks like 15 frames per second or something, whereas this one looks closer to like 25 or 30 frames per second. Anyway, not a big deal, but it does kind of suck that for all that extra CPU time, it's not animating as smoothly as the other one. I suppose what we could do now is toggle this off and see if the CPU usage changes drastically. So we'll kill that off and let it stabilize a little bit. So it does look like power auras went down a little bit. It's down to like 2.6, 2.5, somewhere in there. So it does use a little bit less CPU when it's not displaying any auras, but it still uses some. Weak auras dropped from whatever the heck it was. Let's just actually cast it again to compare. Looks like from 0.23-ish.
I can't cast that yet.
Yeah, 2 point change, 2.3, 2.4, something like that, down to 0.6 when it's not actually, or 0.06 when it's not displaying anything. So its CPU usage goes down by about 75% whenever an aura isn't displayed. So that kind of indicates that perhaps there's an additional cost in power auras for having auras defined, where even if they're not displayed, they're going to use up some CPU time. That's something we might want to investigate. We can see from our charts here that power auras is used almost twice as much CPU. The memory usage is pretty similar, so that's good, I guess. But maybe it's just that the triggering cost is more expensive or something like that. So maybe we'll try making another aura. I'll bring up power auras, and let's do a 2 trigger aura. So the first thing I need to do is hit new, and let's see. I'll make this one trigger on having a particular stance. Let's say like if I'm in Seal of Truth and I have Blessing of Kings, then we'll show, let's use a 3D model just because Power Auras does that, and I don't think many people know about it. So the first thing we want to do is we'll set this to stance. Where is that? Stance/seal. And then we have to choose which one we want, and that'll be Seal of Truth. And that's all I really have to do. So that's done. Now, I don't really want this aura to display. I just need it as a trigger condition. So what I'm going to do is hold Shift and click on it, and that sets it to off. And now this is still being evaluated in the background, but it won't display the actual aura. Now I can create a new one, and we will make this for player buff. I'll turn off some of this extra stuff. I'm leaving ignore case on because I don't want to have to guess whether of is capital or lowercase or whatever. So the unit will be player, and the spell name will be Blessing of Kings. I think we'll use Kings. That's a good example. So we set that there. Now I want to add a second condition to this, and the way I do it is I hover over here, and besides stance/seal, the very first thing in the tooltip is a 2 in brackets. That 2 is the ID of this aura. And if I come to this box down here, I can enter a 2. And now what it's going to do is say, check all of these things, these configurations for buffs and stuff I've set up. And if they're true, also check this ID's, or this aura's sets of conditions. That'll be my stance. And if that's true as well, then display this. Now let's configure a 3D model. So if I click on models, get this thing kind of in the middle of my screen. It's a little hard to see, so I'm going to just pull it off to the side, something like that. And I want to use a different model. I think I'll use Arthas, and I know that's somewhere around 100 because I ran through this once already. So I'm just going to drag this through. And you can see it's a little different from how it is in weak auras. I have to kind of scroll through this list, which is a little, kind of sucks for finding things, but whatever, it's doing the job. So I can choose from about 150-ish different models, which is a pretty good start. Got my Arthas there. I'm just going to close these up. And now I'm going to make the same aura in weak auras. So I'm going to bring up weak auras, and I'm going to make a new model. And I'll call this BK. Now I need to choose a model, and actually I'm going to hit cancel and just copy and paste so I can go back to it really quick. So in weak auras, the way you would browse for models is a little nicer. You can see that I have this nice window and I can click through all the different things. They're categorized. Right, like whatever. Yeah, so there they are. If we look down here, we can see that I have my weak auras options, which I think we talked about already. And then I also have weak auras model paths, and that's also broken out into its own add-on. It uses about 5 meg of RAM. And that has just the paths for all the different models. So you won't have this loaded unless you're actually configuring a new 3D model aura and you're doing the browsing. Otherwise, it never loads. So it's a little different architecture. Kind of helps cut down on weak auras CPU and memory usage a little bit. So I'm going to just paste back in Arthas. And I'm going to drag him over here. Maybe make him a little bit bigger, a little bit wider, just to be more consistent. I think maybe I'll have to adjust his Z. Something like that. That's close enough, I think. Good enough for comparison. And now I just need to set my trigger conditions. So I'll come in and I'll say aura, status, player, stance, form, aura. And I want this to be in Seal of Truth. And then I need to add a second trigger. And the way I do that is I just hit add trigger. And I choose all trigger because I want both of these to be true before it displays the sky. If any of them would do the job, then I would choose any trigger, but that's not the case. And this one is going to be an aura. And it's an aura on the player that's a buff, and it's called Blessing of Kings. So there we go. So we've done a bit of configuration, and I think once again, just because sitting idle, Power Auras uses up a lot of CPU, and it's not really fair to compare it like that. What I'm going to do is just slash console reload UI, so that way everything will get cleared out and reset, and we'll compare just our displays once again. So I'm going to hit Seal of Righteousness to get out of Seal of Truth, bring up our comparison window here, and then I'm going to hit Blessing of Kings, and it still hasn't shown our auras, that's good. And then I'm going to cast Seal of Truth, and now both of those are true, and our Lich Kings show up as auras. We'll just let them sit for a few seconds and collect some information about how they display. So, looking here, it seems like memory usage is pretty similar, which you would expect. They're doing basically the same thing as far as putting these things on the screen. It's not very difficult. Let's see, for CPU usage, Ecores is strangely using almost none. I guess that's just because of the kind of trigger that we did. It seems to be more efficient to do that with weak auras. Yeah, it's not using very much CPU at all. Power auras seems to be using actually quite a lot, 400-ish. I wonder what happens if we just recast Blessing of Kings a bunch. Does that make weak auras use more CPU?
That spell isn't ready yet.
So I'm just going to spam click this and maybe toggle these on and off a little bit.
My mana is low.
Oh, I have no mana. There we go. So those triggers did cause weak auras to use a bit of CPU, but not a whole lot. Power auras seems to be using about 0.4%, so it's gone up quite a bit. Let's disable this aura and see what happens to our CPU usage. Obviously weak auras can't get any lower, but maybe power auras will drop a bit. So it did seem to go down to about 0.35, which is still more than the last time around, so it seems like each aura we add has just some sort of burden on power auras that's constantly there. That's a bit interesting. Maybe let's bring up our configuration windows once more, and we'll make one more kind of aura, and we'll make a whole bunch of them. That way we can compare a more realistic set, because most people don't have one or two auras. They probably have like 10 of them, and let's imagine that they're all on screen. So what I'm going to do is bring up power auras, and to cheat a little bit, where's my text editor? I actually made these in advance and just made export strings. So I have 10 auras here. And they all trigger on Blessing of Kings. So I'm just going to come to import set. Let's switch back to this one. We'll go import set. And I'm going to paste that in. And so now we have 10 auras. kind of unfortunate they replaced the ones that we already had. That kind of sucks, but whatever. So we've just got 10 auras, and they're all basically the same. They're just texture with some movement animation stuff going on. And I just changed the X offsets a little bit so that they would be visible as 10 auras. But otherwise, they're all identical. For weak auras, we can do the same basic thing. I guess because power auras deleted its... actually, I think I'll recreate them just to... We want to keep having more auras. So what I'm going to do is edit the video, and I'm just going to recreate those ones. Alright, so I've gone through and I've just recreated those auras that were missing. You can see there's nothing really special about them. Yeah, I guess I just didn't know much about how the import worked. Anyway, let's do the same thing with weak auras. We're going to create 10 auras that fire on Blessing of Might. So we will bring up my import string here. And I just tossed these into a group so that it'll be a little easier to manage. Hit import, hit paste, done, and hit import. And there we go. So we can see it's the same basic thing. They just are some auras. They trigger on Blessing of Might, and they have some like trivial animation. Anyway, that's good enough, I think. So I think what I'll do is reload the UI because configuring all that stuff has made things look kind of unfair. So /console reload UI. So we'll give them both a nice clean slate, and then we will do some comparisons. So go through once more, and we'll just say, let's see, where did that thing go? Put this up here, I guess. So the first thing we'll do is we'll check our Blessing of Kings. So we have the wrong seal, we put a Blessing of Kings, the right seal, and Power Auras is using quite a bit more CPU. We'll click that off. Next we'll put up, I guess Blessing of Might's a good next one to go to. So here we can see all of the different auras. The top set that's kind of doing a small circle is driven by weak auras, and the bottom kind of spinning bar one is Power Auras Classic. Unfortunately, I couldn't get quite the same animation between the two. That was weird. I don't know if you saw that jankiness. Yeah, Power Auras just doesn't have quite the animation control that weak auras does, and I didn't want to go digging through code to make the exact same functions. But they're basically the same. It's just some auras sliding around on screen, so it should be pretty similar in terms of demand. One thing I'm noticing, watch when these spin, you kind of see the animation sometimes janks out a bit in Power Auras. I guess it's got fixed, so that's good. Oh no, there it goes. They seem to be doing basically the same thing. Looking at memory usage is pretty similar. CPU usage, weak auras is around 1 point change, and Power Auras is around 0.7-ish. Yeah, the Power Auras keeps having animation issues, which kind of sucks. Let's fire up a few more add-ons, or a few more auras, and just see what happens. So we'll bring up our Blessing of, or our Righteous Fury aura, and our spinning things. See how that affects things. So we've got weak auras up to like 0.8, 0.9, somewhere in there. Power Aura seems pretty stable at 1.1-ish. Maybe we'll also, I guess we can't really have both of those up with 3D auras. I think now what we should do is maybe shut off all of these and see how good they are getting back to like a base amount of CPU use. So I'll just click off these buffs. All of our auras disappear. And weak auras is still using around 0.4, 0.6. So let's call it 0.6% CPU. That seems about fair. 0.06 rather. Power Auras is still up around 0.9, maybe 1% CPU, so it seems to be using like 10 times more, actually more than that, like 15 times more CPU. During that whole animation sequence, like where we were testing things, weak auras used about 900-ish, and Power Auras seems to have used around 1800, so it looks like Power Auras uses roughly twice as much CPU as weak auras, which is probably not surprising if you're familiar with weak auras, but if you didn't realize those extra configuration options don't necessarily mean that it performs worse. you might not have expected that. You might have thought that weak auras is so powerful it must be harder to run, but I guess that's not the case. One last thing we could do is reload our UI and not fire up anything and just see if there's any cost to just having auras in the background, like not even ever displayed. So what I'll do is just reload the UI once again. And where's my tooltip thing there? So here we are, fresh login, nothing going on. And yeah, that old behavior where weak auras doesn't use any CPU at all, and power auras uses like almost 1% just for having a dozen auras, seems to hold. So yeah, I guess that's good enough for just a trivial set of benchmarks. If people can think of a better way to test these, I'm all for it. But in the meantime, it seems like weak auras is probably the more performance add-on based on just some trivial tests. Well, I hope that was at least somewhat informative. Take care.